objectives which it set out are not being met by the institutions of national state, be it the executive or government, be it the legislature or the parliament, be it the judiciary, be it by the commissions, whether it be the service commissions, the integrity commissions, and all of that are in the Republican Constitution. They have all failed and have collapsed. And what we need to have is a revolution of the mind to imagine a second republic. And unless we do that, then we are going to be going into a society that is even nastier and where life will be shorter and even more brutish than it is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Mark? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Close the machine. Thank you. I am reflecting forward, not backward, although we can step back a little to go forward in terms of some of the ideas of our Caribbean economists. But I think in reflecting going forward, one of the things that connects with what my colleagues have said is the question of institutions. And one of the studies that we are looking at doing in Jamaica is to reflect on those institutions in the country that have been successful. In other words, which of our institutions have been successful and why? Whether these are institutions of a commercial nature, whether in the state or in the purely commercial sector, whether they are regulatory institutions, whether they're educational institutions. So for example, Jamaica has some very successful institutions, although maybe as a society it has not been as successful as it could have been. For example, the Inter-Secondary School Championship in Jamaica is a very successful institution. When it celebrated its 100th anniversary recently, the BBC made a big thing of it. I know of no other high school event that received that kind of international acclaim. Our housing trust is a very outstanding public sector institution. So I think that one of the things in going forward with the economy is we need to understand which of our institutions have been successful and why. And because, as my colleagues have said, the question of governance and the question of institutions and the quality of institutions in society are fundamental in our cases. And many of our economists have spoken to this. But having made a forward-looking point, I make a slightly backward-looking one. And Carrie made the point about the moment when Lewis intervened. And I often lecture on Lewis, and I've lectured on Lewis in this hall before. What was Lewis's model? His mother taught him two things. One, anything they can do, we can do. And make the best use of what you have. That's the Lewis model. So that, updating it as Carrie has said, you have to come to the moment and say, what do we have to do now with the present situation that we face? Reflecting on our other economists too, on the work of Levitt and Best, for example, one of the key questions they asked is, what is the unit of analysis? And that is a very important question that remains for the Caribbean, because my colleagues have spoken about the diaspora. What is the Caribbean, right? And in reflecting on Best Thought and Freedom at a conference that Selwyn put on a number of years ago, I wrote a paper on that in terms of what is the Caribbean. The strength of the United States as a power is because we are all Americans in one way or another. I don't know how many of you don't watch American programs on TV or don't eat American fast food. I'm a little on the edge. I don't do much of that. But there's a sense in which we are all part of the cultural power of the United States. And one of the things the Caribbean is a cultural superpower. And there's a sense in which everyone who visits the Caribbean, who has been touched by the Caribbean experience, is a Caribbean person. So everybody who has attended Carnival in Trinidad, or indeed in Canada, is a Trinidadian. And I think we need to understand how we build diasporic platforms and cultural platforms for the future of our economies. And it comes back to what Godfrey was saying. Is he still here? About the demographics. We're not paying enough attention to our demographics, which includes the migration, as well as the aging and all the other components that he was talking about. Reflecting on another point is that at the end of the day, when you're looking at the economy, you're looking at it sectorally. We've spoken already to how Dennis saw the mining sector and to ensure that we do not just waste what is a windfall, and that we utilize our mineral resources in a sustainable way. But Carrie also spoke to something that was fundamental to Lewis's idea of the industrial and the agricultural revolution. The agricultural sector has been so disgracefully neglected in the Caribbean, under the concept that agriculture is something that people who have no intelligence or who cannot do any better seek to do. And in part, I blame those who called Lewis's thing industrialization by invitation. Because Lewis's main idea was that you needed to develop the agricultural sector. That was his main idea, globally, and here too. But we have taught our people that agriculture is for idiots and half-wits. The opportunities in agriculture in the Caribbean remain fundamentally important, and there are enormous opportunities in agriculture. And what Carrie has said also is that building agriculture in the Caribbean is fundamental to building resilience. And one of the major problems with economics today is that economics has been driven by a very narrow view of, let us say, a Smithian paradigm. And we have left the Smithian paradigm altogether, in the sense that we no longer talk about comparative advantage, you know. We now talk about competitive advantage. So you must do everything possible to be competitive. We no longer believe that monopolies and oligopolies are bad, because large companies are more competitive. So that within the developed world, they accept mergers of all sorts and all types. But what are we driven by? We're driven by freer trade, larger units, more interconnection towards efficiency. But the more efficient you become is the less resilient you are. And this is what the crisis demonstrated. So that economists need to go back and think about the resilience. Because Smith gave the example of how much more efficient the factory is at producing pins than the individual artisan. But in a crisis, the factory can't even produce one pin, whereas the individual artisan may be able to cobble together a few. So that we need to rebalance the question of resilience. And in our countries, resilience means agriculture in part. I have one or two other insights. One is, I lived part of my life in what the Americans call the boondocks, right? Hicksville, USA. Nowheresville, right? And one of the things we didn't understand in the Caribbean, those of us who are nationalists especially, is that migration from the Caribbean is nothing more than urbanization, right? When my brother-in-law left the hills of Clarendon to go to London, right, he had never been to Kingston, right? So that he, coming from a poor peasant background, urbanized, not to Kingston, but he urbanized to London, right? And one of the issues we have to face is that the drive towards urbanization in the Caribbean has taken people to Paris and Montreal and Toronto and New York and London. And that is something we haven't quite come to terms with. So that people leaving the Caribbean, which in the old days we used to see them as traitors, as my Cuban friends say, gusanos, which means worms. And as there's a famous song in Jamaica, say, one more Jamaican gone abroad, one more disciple leave the yard. But it's part of an urbanization process, which we were caught up in. So that's something we have to come to terms with. The diaspora, migration, remigration, and the extent to which we now have transnational families, transnational communities, and the extent to which Brooklyn is a Jamaican city, as is Miami a Jamaican city. The other point I wanted to make is about FDI, and I made it in my presentation, but I didn't push it home hard, which is that people keep talking about FDI, right? And as Beckford said long ago and others, the Caribbean was created by FDI. So how does FDI become a solution to our problems? Now, Lewis, who was the most favorable towards FDI, was not one of the unconditional advocates of FDI, which we hear people keep repeating this, what we need is foreign investment. Now we need labor flexibility, David, in order to facilitate and so forth. But yes, whatever role foreign capital can play, it has to be within a context, right, where it is not just a race to the bottom, as they say. So that is an important way forward. But in terms of seeing a positive way forward, for me, we have to look at the individual sectors and we have to develop them in the way in which we know to do, based on what Panting said, based on what Lewis has said and others. We know what to do. We need to develop them in a way that helps our people. But we need to develop the institutions which can do it. And we need to foster the institutions that are capable of doing it. And we need to be critical of those that are not. But of course, however good our ideas may be, ideas are meaningless unless they have a social movement driving them forward. So that we saw in his own way, Dennis was trying to build social movements of citizens which can connect with the ideas, many of good ideas that have been created, which can drive them forward for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, David, Brother Ralph, and Carrie for your contributions. I think what we've gotten from our four panelists so far is what I call a lesson in Caribbean economic history and thought, effectively locating what has been happening in our Caribbean economies, not only in the context of Dennis Panton's work, the person we celebrate at COTE 2014, but looking at some of the other historical insights, the work of Arthur Lewis, for example, the work of Norman Govan and others, and really somehow pointing to the fact that we find ourselves at a kind of crossroads. I think Brother Ralph, made the point that Lewis, or Carrie made the point that Lewis recognized that something needed to be done in the 1930s and the 50s, etc., which led him to the writing some of the seminal pieces that we study in our teachings here on the campus. David making the point about Panton as an activist, and Dennis using his scholarship. He wasn't an activist simply for the sake of being an activist, but he used his position as an intellectual and as a scholar to inform his activism, and his activism was really about getting grassroots people on board so that they understood what was happening in the society and the role they can play. Carrie making the point about we having to seriously consider the positive vision that Dennis had for small island developing states through his work, what he called econologism, identifying ways in which small island developing states can craft or can identify models for sustainable development that might be replicated by other countries, and Mark Figueroa effectively consolidating these ideas, talking again about the work of Pantin and others in the context of Caribbean economic history. I don't know if there are any questions from the floor at this point in time, or any comments that persons wish to make from the floor at this point in time. I see I have one hand. Again, a student. I congratulate Lita Vaughan for being so engaged in the process this afternoon.
Good afternoon to everyone again. Okay, so
A little more volume.
good afternoon to everyone.
Right.
Hear me? Right. So I want to thank Professor Levitt, Professor Mark Figueroa, Dr. Ralph Henry, and Mr. Abdullah for that very intrinsic look at our history. I think it makes sense. But my question, basically, I want to set a context and then pose the question. I borrow from literature and I borrow from international relations to pose the question to everybody so I can answer it. If we look at what the trend of the 2 days were, we basically analyzing where we are, where we came from, and what we have to do, because we have to do something. We can't continue as we are. I just want to borrow from Shakespeare. He was saying in Macbeth that I'm stepped in blood so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as I go. Meaning that he's come to the realization that, hey, what am I doing? What I'm doing now is not making sense. And I've gone so far that if I were to stop and I turn around, there's a huge gap behind me and there's a huge gap in front of me. Where do I go? And I'm borrowing from international relations in the sense that the Caribbean has more or less just adopted. We've just sat down and took what these European, what these US states have said is good for us. We're looking at trade liberalization, evaluation, the whole thought of what development should be. And a number of speakers throughout the course of the day, the 2 days, have said that more or less that we as a region believe that we're not sufficient. We view ourselves as deficient, as not to come up with ideas for our own development. For example, the indicators. And speaking as a youth, I tend to feel like, I think Dr. Henry was making the point, or Dr. Figueroa, one of the two, that the Caribbean states are just floating around in mid-air. Nobody seems to know what's really going on. And a classic example is the decay in the society. And I just want to use the environment that we are in currently, the university environment. We have youths. I'm a youth, I would say I'm a youth, just sitting down, totally clueless as to what's going on, how certain things impact them, and they just have this ramage attitude where we jump on wine and fete, and nobody seems to quite understand, well, not taking stock of what's going on. You mightn't see, as Melanie was saying, this NIMBY, not in my backyard attitude. It's not affecting me, so I quite frankly don't care. And I think that's the attitude that's killing us. It killed the basic unit of society. It stemmed from family to the home, and it just trickled all the way through. So my question, based on that context, given the current constraints that we face as a region, how do you propose or speculate that we go forward based on all these constraints?
There's another question at the back. Is that Pat? Yeah, okay.
Good afternoon, all. I am a student in the Department of Behavioral Sciences, a PhD student. And my research actually revisited some of the fundamental assumptions that, that were made when what we have as present economic and social theories were constructed. And as I sat and I listened to the presentations, you know, something the young man just said. He said, we've gone so far. Are we going to stop and look back? And in order for us to stop and look back, we have to look back at some of the, you know, the intellectual giants that as we know them, like Hegel and Marx and so on. And interestingly enough, I find that starting with the Brundtland Commission report of 1987 and coming forward, where he said, and this goes right to Professor Panton's work on sustainable livelihoods. You know, Brundtland said that there is hope in indigenous communities. They know how to cooperate. They know how to do it. What is it about these communities that that allow them to be held together, that allow them to live in harmony with their environment? And at the time, it was sustainable livelihoods. And you know, Prof. Panton did this research across the Caribbean, and he came up with the concept of, well, they developed the concept of sustainable livelihoods, and they looked at these indigenous communities and how they were impacting on their environment. Today, I must say that I sort of agree with the young man. You know, we have all the methodology down pat. We are excellent methodologists, and the analyses and the statistical analyses and the statistical models are excellent, but we are confronting a gap, you know, between the theory and some of those and the practice. So actually my thesis, I actually attempted to do that, and you know, I became a little bit of an activist, even though I'm a social scientist. And I saw that the same type of communal organizations that held the people together, if we replicate it, if we model it, and we put it into these bureaucratic places that people are so divided, that we can bring back some of those communal values. So what we actually were doing is conflating the institutions. So we're not just seeing an economic institution one way, kinship one way, social one way, and so on, and education one way, but it was conflated into one tiny unit. And I found that you know, I saw positive, you know, outcomes. And this is coming straight out of, you know, our Caribbean scholarship. You know, having read Beckford, having read Professor Panton, having looked at Arthur Lewis and going back to, you know, that the fundamentals when he made that break, you know, to suggest the investment, the direct investment, the foreign direct investments. He actually said we must have a strong agricultural sector. We should actually be producing for ourselves.
Sure. Pat, we want to thank you for that comment, and I want to ask if there's any other, particularly student or anyone from the audience who wants to make any other comment or pose a question, because I want to ask the panelists to just spend 3 to 5 minutes each looking at, well, responding to Vaughn's question in terms of the gap, where we are in terms, sorry?
I like that. Well, a comment most like.
All right, great.
Well, just like from carrying out my research, and I like that everybody on the panel identified one key thing that I realized was lacking in sustainable development is, in general, is institutional sustainability. The fact that what everybody basically identified is that institutional sustainability is the way we think and organize ourselves. And because we are lacking in institutional sustainability, meaning that we have an education system that is not just in terms of producing people who are technologically oriented or innovative. We have a government system that basically do what they want and don't include the population into their planning and organization. That's why we have issues such as the highway reroute movement, issues in terms of our corruption and how we perceive a government. That's why when government come to parliament and bring measures to improve our constitution, people protested because they feel left out and because we just don't include them, and we need to change the way we think and how we organize our institution. And institution is not just all the thing, is a mindset and how we think for the future.
Sure.
And I appreciate that. You know, it just showed me like that what I was learning in my research is the same thing that other people around was seeing.
Shows you on the right track.
Yeah.
All right, okay.
Yeah, well, I will jump in. The first thing I want to say is that although we have challenges in the Caribbean, the truth is we haven't done that badly. And although David says everything has collapsed, I haven't noticed it. And and there's a sense in which, there are two senses. One in which I come from the Jamaican middle classes, and better off Jamaicans have been sensing for 400 years an imminent danger. That imminent threat has not yet destroyed us. So that I think that although many of us have a lot of angst, especially those of us who have dedicated more than 40 years to trying to bring the Caribbean closer to its potential, I think that there's a sense in which we haven't done as badly as we could have, and we have not done as badly as many other states have. So that I think that that is a balance that I would like to throw into the mix. On the other hand, I think that the question as to where we go forward, which was the precise question that was being asked, I think that we need to identify those institutions that can carry us forward. But when I was a political activist, one of our slogans was, you have to connect in order to contend, right? So if it's Ramajay, I don't know how you connect with that still, but to bring about change. But we have to connect with what people can see, with what people can understand, with where people's dissatisfactions are, and to build social movements which can connect with ideas that can bring about change. Hopefully you'll be more successful than some of us have been over the years. But in terms of the pure economics of it, I think that certainly, I think it was Roger whose presentation pointed to some of the serious weaknesses in government policy in Trinidad and Tobago, where how resources are allocated in terms of make-work schemes, which are subsidizing people to be employed to do things that may not necessarily need to be done in that way, but those subsidies could be applied in different ways to bring about transformations in the economy. And certainly one particular area which I speak to is in relation to is agriculture. But throughout the Caribbean, the problem of corruption and the problem of procurement that was discussed certainly is a significant one. Because, again, I give you the Jamaican example. I mean, I accept corruption, so you give your friends the road to build, right? Well, nothing wrong with giving your friend the road to build in our context. But just insist that they build the road, right? They say you must build the road badly, so you'll get another contract next year to build the road again. Well, no, just build this one right, and we give you a contract next year to build another one right. So, for example, one of the things that upsets me in Jamaica is that if I were a visitor to Jamaica and saw the roads after the rain, I would say, my goodness, sir, this is a 100-year event? Or is this a 20-year event? Because when you see the roads in Jamaica after a shower of rain, you could not believe that it happens every year that it rains like that. Now, give your friend a contract to build a drain. You know, nothing wrong with that. But we need to establish like a margin. We'd say you T 50%, but you contribute 50. Okay?
Thank you, Mark. Brother Ralph.
I could understand the almost exasperation of the young man at the back who asked, where are we going? But I think it brings us back to the fundamental question, and that is, it's about a worldview, having a view of ourselves vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And I think this is one of the contributions of Dennis and others, that there was that sense of a worldview, a sense of ourselves, a kind of confidence about ourselves, about a possibility of all being able to create something in our own space. Create something that is of value and of sustainable value in our own space. And in the absence of that, and I feel that there are a large number of our people who are disconnected. Yes, we do get some, yes, Mark is right, that in terms of material comforts, well, we do enjoy certain standards, and the indicators may show that. But beyond that, that sense of where we are going has to be based on a perception of the self and a perception of our space in the world. And this is what I suppose differentiates people like Lloyd Best, Carey, of course, in the Canadian context, you know, Lewis. When you read Lewis, you can feel that sense of a young colonial looking around and saying that, yes, I feel we can do better. And we will do better. And all of his work was about that. And likewise, you see it with Dennis. And maybe we have failed, and failed you, and maybe you have to take up the cudgels yourself, that we have failed you in your not feeling that when you look around, that yes, I can be confident of being able to do something in this space. I can look at that world and feel that I can interact with it, I can engage in it, and not just ramager. I can engage with it with a certain level of confidence. The challenge that we face, of course, is that the values that we have inculcated along the way are not appropriate to the new paradigm that we have to adopt.
David, and then we will carry the last word. David, you'll get the last word.
Yeah. Yes, well, the wisest one amongst us will speak last, right? Now, I'll be very brief. I think that I want to come back to something that Carrie said in her lecture the other night when she talked about the importance of teaching the theory of knowledge and critical thinking. I want to add critical thinking, that we need to ensure that the ideas that are generated, coming back to Mark's point, that the ideas generated are ideas that come out of our own experience, but also point the way forward. One of the demarcations of current Caribbean society, as distinct from the 30s and 40s, where the labor movement was out front, defining a vision for the region, and had policy agenda to link to that, the achievement of that vision, and so on. And if you read Arthur Lewis's book, Labor in the West Indies, which Susan Craig, Dr. Susan Craig James did the forward to, and then afterward, it was a very important description of where the region was at in the 30s and the kind of very advanced thinking of the Caribbean labor movement at the time. And in the point Carrie is making a lecture too, that in the 50s and early 60s, there was again a sense of vision. It was a nationalist movement, but there was a sense of vision. So if you think about Eric Williams or Grantley Adams or Norman Manley and so on, people were motivated, or society was motivated to try and achieve something. There was a sense that we, not just individuals, but collectively the society had somewhere to go, and that we were all going to try and get there. But if we did a quick survey around this room or on campus and so on, and ask anyone, what is the vision for Trinidad and Tobago today? Or what is the vision for Jamaica or the Caribbean today? I don't know that anybody could say that there is a vision, something that to which all of us could feel, this is we're going to get excited about and motivate ourselves around and contribute to the achievement of, as against individual goals. I want to be somewhere in 20 years or 30 years. But where do we want our society to be 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and so on? So I think that we need to reimagine our future. That's something that Wendell McMahon of Three Canals said to me, that we need to reimagine our future. If we don't have a process of reimagining our future, then for the young men who the education system has failed, and I heard the Minister of Education say that 95% of all of those who wrote CAPE this June gone, May, June this year, got at least a pass. They got grades between 1 and 5, and 70% got grades between 1 and 3. So, okay, that was great. But then he didn't say how many of the young people who entered secondary school finished secondary school, and how many of those who got to fifth form came out of fifth form with 5 CSEC passes. Now, that is the statistic that we need to be focusing on. And then to say, those young people who didn't complete secondary school, don't have 5 CSEC passes and so on, how do they imagine their future? And if they have no sense and can't imagine a future, then in fact, being part of a gang where life is going to be short makes sense, because there is no future that they could imagine or seek to work towards. So public policy now has to be not just dry, it also has to spark an imagination. It has to be linked to vision. And perhaps our generation can't do it and your generation will, but I think that your generation has to be supported by theory of knowledge, a sense of our own history, as well as critical, an appreciation of critical thinking and so on. And the social movement of which we were all a part of. And Mark, don't give up, some of us are still gray, but still building social movements.
Well, you haven't left me very much to add to all of this, but I'm going to find something. You know, Mark said, well, we haven't done too badly here. Look around and life, compared with many other parts of the world, is very good. That's true. And it is perhaps more true of this country in Trinidad, which is really quite a rich country by any standard. Enormous, and continued over many years of the monetization of the natural, of the God-given wealth that is under the ground. And it has, of course, many foolish and bad things have been done, but many very good things have been done. And as I am back on this campus and look around at the amazing number of buildings and facilities and students, all of whom don't pay any fees and get a lot of support and books from school. My goodness, in Montreal 2 years ago, we had a strike by students. They sustained for most of the academic year in order to prevent an increase in fees. They were radical. I have a lot of respect for those young people. And they actually suggested that we should have free education. Well, the people, what? How could you possibly suggest that? You're already lucky in Quebec. Your fees are lower than they are in Ontario, never mind the United States, where students come out of university carrying a burden of $40,000, $50,000. So a lot of progress has been made. But just because there is a lot of money in this country, I think that is why it is possible to raise the kind of question that was raised in that wonderful presentation by Amanda that many of us heard about La Brea. And the description of that town and that community, which is in the area where some of the first tar was exploited, and that there was a time when there was a flourishing market and an abattoir and a tannery, in other words, a livestock industry and a fish market, and was clearly a flourishing and successful and happy town. And that is no longer the case, although the country is much richer, and but the amount of money that is invested and the produce and the profits that flow from the oil gas industry throughout that whole region of Trinidad is very, very great. So when, in the course of that presentation, which I may say also was extraordinary in an application of highly sophisticated statistical demographic techniques by the late Dennis Brown, whom some of us knew was, since he was a student in Jamaica. As I say, sophisticated application of statistical techniques, but nevertheless, what was revealed was in many ways a regression, certainly a regression of the social community life of La Brea. And I then had the thought that in some respects, La Brea is a little piece of the whole of this country, because in some respects, I say, we have had a regression since former days. I'm talking of the days, the 70s, the 60s, 50s, I don't know, I wasn't here yet. But it raises issues that go far beyond economics or the social sciences, and really raises basic issues of values, you know, of what kind of, been mentioned by others here, what sort of society do we wish to live in? What are the national objectives of the government, of any government of this country? What should it be? We hear a lot about competitiveness. We hear about an international index of competitiveness. It is as if the nations of the world are in competition for who could be more competitive. Does it make any sense? I mean, really, does this affect lives of people? It seems to me that this is an abstraction even more bizarre than GDP per capita, which in itself doesn't mean very much to ordinary people either. So let's go, in a sense, what does matter? And in a way, people know what matters. People know. It's not that people don't know, in a way, what's right and what's wrong. But there is an assumption that somehow common sense of common people has to take a side in comparison with technology and science and economics as it is taught currently. And the reason why I am saying there has been a regression applies, I'm afraid, to the teaching of economics. And here, in this country, but also in the United States, in the English-speaking world. I am an economist, I'm a development economist, and I am a great believer in the teaching of the history of economic thought. And the discipline of economics as it, in the academy, as it is practiced in the best and the mediocre, and no doubt also the worst universities, has narrowed into a set of abstractions of relationships and equations and etc., like a closed system a closed system that is basically quite simple, in fact simplistic, but can be presented in very sophisticated ways to create models. And we have arrived at the stage where the criterion of an academically properly trained economist has to do with his or her ability to make models, I'm sorry, I know and swear that many students who have been quite well-versed in how to make the models, first of all, are not interested, and nor is anybody else, in what they show. It is how clever you are in the techniques and the technologies and the statistical games, etc. So that quite very sophisticated columnists can tell you that, well, the economists, they have a black box, and they're very clever, and they produce results out of that, and we just have to believe that because we don't really know what's going on there. I'm exaggerating a little, but what has happened, I believe, in this region and in many other parts of the world, is that in an effort to meet standards which have been set elsewhere in the metropole with respect to economics curricula, we have taken a step back. In two respects. One, because the economics profession itself is in regression, and secondly, because the practice of taking what is done in the metropole as the standard to be emulated is also a regression, is a twofold regression then here. So I think we really have to go back to that older perspective that Ralph and others talked about. I think perhaps most dramatically illustrated by Lloyd Best, because he just used to insist that we here in the Caribbean are at the center of the universe. We're in the center and we're looking out at the rest of the world. There's a certain merit to that view. However, I must say that if you want to look out on the rest of the world, you'd better cast right over the edge of the horizon and look at the whole of the rest of the world. Not only what goes on in the Atlantic, but what goes on in Latin America, in China, in India, in many other parts of the world. And here I believe that I'm noticing a lack of information and perhaps a lack of interest. And let me start first with what seemed to me a lack of knowledge of the critique in the North America, in Britain, in the English-speaking world, of that economic model that is so abstract and that is so divorced from institutions and from society, that is somehow riding above society like a sort of a closed system of relationships. There is a lot of very important critical literature there. It's on many, many blogs. It's all over the place. And I find people interested here should go to look at more of that. And then, of course, there is that more multipolar world that is emerging, that Ralph again referred to. And I think we have to think more in terms of looking out, to look at our place in that larger world that is rapidly changing, that is undergoing geopolitical and geo-economic shifts, in which, yes, China's rise, China's remarkable social industrial revolution of increasing its total output in 30 years, 16-fold or something, is a phenomenon, but it is not the only cause, it is not the only kind of change. much of the change in Latin America has come from within. It has come as a reaction against the Washington Consensus, market-oriented, foreign investment begging kind of policies. After all, it was the intervention in many ways of Brazil that saved this region from being enfolded into the FTA, the foreign trade of the Americas. I know some people in this town were just preparing and making a bid that Port of Spain should be the headquarters of that organization, without realizing how damaging it would have been in many ways. So let me just say that how much I enjoyed being here, how happy I was to be invited, how excellent were many of the presentations, and that if I am feeling critical towards the directions in which this economics department has gone, it is not for lack of respect of anybody. It is just that I feel that it is a double regression, both in the content of what is being emphasized, i.e. that model building, rather than that wider socially based approach, and in the inevitable mimicry, which is built into the system. It is a vicious system because it is impossible for young people to gain the promotions and the acknowledgements without publishing in certain journals, and those journals, so-called, I don't know, prestige journals, I may say many of which are not read by anybody very much except other graduate students who have to know what is the model that they're supposed to follow if they wish to ensure a career. And this is what happens in some of the best universities, including my own at McGill, where I have colleagues and very senior colleagues who have said that they have had a persistent disadvantage because they did not go the route of the econometric models, but they went other routes that actually are more productive and interesting. So I can't go on forever here. Somewhere I have to finish, and I'm not able to find a wonderful flourish with which to end this panel. So I will say just until the next meeting. Thank you.